Focus on the belt buckle. Yeah, time. We're set.
Everybody get comfortable there. Well, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's panel, which is featuring students who are in the senior seminar in History and Political Science. We call this particular panel Into the Woods, Tales of Forestry, Escaped Prisoners, and the Missionary Impulse. That's the best we could do to tie all of these papers together. So I will introduce each of the speakers in turn, which will give a chance for people to get up and move about in between. But each speaker will be speaking for about 15 minutes, and we'll have about 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll move on to the next person. Our first speaker today is Rhys Bryden-Williams, who is a member of the forestry crew, and his research comes out of some of his experience with that crew. And his presentation today is Service and Selection, the Advising of Warren Wilson College Forest Management by the North Carolina Forest Service. Rhys.
Thank you very much, Phil. Welcome everyone to the history portion of the 2014 Capstone Carnival. As Phil has said, this is Service and Selection, the Advising of Warren Wilson College Forest Management by the North Carolina Forest Service. In this presentation, I hope to elucidate two main points. Firstly, that the histories of Warren Wilson College and the North Carolina Forest Service both intertwine and parallel in many key respects. And secondly, that the instances of the North Carolina Forest Service participating in consultation with Warren Wilson College are a prime example of the North Carolina Forest Service's general outlook and approach to private landowners throughout the 20th and 21st century. The North Carolina Forest Service is marked in many ways by a flexibility when consulting with private landowners. A 2008 pamphlet said that when selecting a private forester, choose a forester who can perpetuate the values of your forest and meet your personal objectives. This has been a recurring trait through the history of the Forest Service, as one of the few constants of private landowners is that, in fact, there is no constant. The Warren Wilson College relationship with the Forest Service dates to roughly about 1956. The two organizations formed within about 3 years of each other. Warren Wilson College in its first incarnation as the Asheville Farm School in 1893. 3 years later, the North Carolina Geographic Survey, which would eventually give rise to the North Carolina Forest Service. The first instance of Warren Wilson College engaging in any synergy with an outside group came in 1943 with Leon Deschamps, a member of the faculty who had close ties to the Tennessee Valley Authority and who was heavily involved in the surveying of the Warren Wilson Forest and the drafting of timber plans for it. However, actual work between Warren Wilson College and the North Carolina Forest Service in any real capacity would not come until 1956. In that year, North Carolina Forest Service Forester B.H. Corpening corresponded with Rupert Dunton, who was at that time the landscaping manager, on the newly acquired Jones Mountain property. He went out and surveyed it, did inventory, replied back to Dunton. Corpening, as we can see here, had a number of advices for Dunton, particularly in the Jones Mountain stand, which had recently been produced. Now, at this time, the main goal of the Forest Service, both around the country and in North Carolina, was the principle of so-called timber primacy, which is that any form of management should be geared primarily towards the growth of functional, healthy timber and subsequent harvesting of it for future generations. Lip service was paid to such concepts as conservation and recreation, but by and large, for private landowners, the main objective was timber harvest. And to this end, he advocated primarily the plantation of white pines on Jones Mountain, and to this end, he advised that student labor, in fact, not be used in that, as such would undermine the efficiency of any such operation. It would be better, in his mind, to go to the Forest Service for such purposes. This was then followed in 1963 by further surveys from the North Carolina Forest Service, in particular the use of aerial photography on the Jones Mountain property. Having had Corpening's survey and having planted these pines, the college sought to invest in aerial photogrammetry in order to better outline maps. One image in particular, image 13238, would provide the basis for most maps in the future. This dates to 1970, a map later to be used by the Forest Service in their future surveys. This consultation, too, advised primarily for timber harvest, particularly in the Jones Mountain and Berea compartments, or what would eventually become these compartments. However, by 1970, the landscape of both the Forest Service and Warren Wilson College had changed. In 1970, the U.S. Forest Service Chief, Ed Cliff, had a memo that outlined a greater potential for conservation in reaction to negative public opinion of the Forest Service. To this end, Warren Wilson College at this point consulted with North Carolina forester H.E. Oxner, who said that the college forest in fact had a greater potential for recreation than is currently the case. To this end, Warren Wilson College, under the benediction of Ernst Larson, who in fact claimed that if we do not follow his advice, we will have wasted Mr. Oxner's time, underwent a forest incentives program for a cost-share agreement, which would significantly reduce the funds that would be necessary to bring the Forest Service out to inventory the forest for recreational or conservational usage. This began, this is another image, this dates from Oxner's time. This is an image he used as reference. And here is a 1970 cost-share agreement that follows from this forest incentives program. This was then followed in 1975 by Eugene R. Hayes, who was the first forester to come out to Warren Wilson proper to survey for conservational purposes. Hayes surveyed the landscape and advocated a selective cut on Jones, not a clear cut or a timber harvest cut, more to release the pines that had been planted following Corpening's survey, and then to do so in a manner that would not interfere with the viewshed of Jones Mountain property. This is unique because this was the first time that at the Warren Wilson campus, recreation had been a primary goal of any sort of recommended management, and followed from the 1970 advances promulgated by Ed Cliff. In turn, in 1979 came the National Forest Management Act, following which the North Carolina Forest Service worked openly with the public. As a result of this, public relations and aesthetics became a valuable asset, perhaps in many cases more so than simple harvesting of timber in some instances. This is an example of the tree marking services performed by Eugene R. Hayes. Here is a cost share form sheet. It is very exciting, as you can see. It's from 1975. Hayes came out on 3 separate occasions, 1975, 1976, and 1977. This, in turn, spawned at Warren Wilson the first comprehensive forest plan, the Haney Plan, promulgated by Forest Manager Alan Haney. This drew on information from Hayes' surveys and elucidated 4 main principles of Warren Wilson College forest management. Protection of forest resources now present, ecological conservation, use of forest resources for the purpose of education of students, maintenance of the aesthetic environment of the community, aesthetics and viewshed, and lastly, optimization of wood yields for lumber, posts, and firewood, timber production. This reflected the changes in Forest Service policy towards landowners, and in fact reflected in many cases the way that the Forest Service was flexible in their dealings with Warren Wilson College. Since the college had, following the 1979 Long Range Land Management Agreement, more of a focus on conservation and on aesthetics, the response to this survey was ultimately promulgated by the Haney Plan. This also reflects a study cited 10 years later in which this was from Minnesota, but in fact is quite relevant here, which listed wildlife habitat first and timber last in terms of official queries by private landowners to the Minnesota Forest Service. The Haney Plan would continue for about 15 years. However, by 1995, it was clear that the forest had matured significantly since 1980, and conditions were no longer the same. As a result, it seemed likely that the Haney Plan would need a significant update. As a result, in 1995, there was an official inquiry by the Forest Service into inventory, which then later led, in fact, to the 1996 Student Forest Management Plan for the college forest, the first comprehensive CFI, or Comprehensive Forest Inventory, for Warren Wilson College. In 1996, two other landmarks were created. This was the first instance of chainsaw training and wildland firefighter training with the Forest Service by Feller Keith Suttles and firefighter David Walker. This established a legacy which has continued to this day. Also in 1998, Jim Merton, a forester with the North Carolina Forest Service, came out to Warren Wilson College. A high priority, he felt, was in controlling invasives, particularly on Jim's Mountain. Invasive species, in particular, having grown to be a major priority of the North Carolina Forest Service, particularly since the 1980s. In fact, one could almost say that the North Carolina Forest Service has since 1970 shifted from timber primacy into a sort of conservation primacy, which in many ways is reflected by the Warren Wilson College advice that has been given. In 1998, U.S. Forest Service Chief Carl Dombeck claimed that the best instance of forest management would be to care for the land and serve the people. To this end, Jim Merton asked for the establishment of streamside management zones on Wilson College campus and invasives removal as a primary focus of conservation work. This was then implemented in the 2002 Jim Eikenberry plan, Jim Eikenberry being the student manager of the Warren Wilson College Forestry crew, or at that time the Natural Resources crew, who suggested fire against invasives. This was, again, in line with Forest Service policy, as since the massive fire season of 2000, a national fire plan had been drawn up for Forest Service to use in order to control the spread of fires via ladder fuels. Following this in 2003 was the Sanders Plan, which in turn built on Eikenberry's plan and furthered it more. The last, and this is the most recent part of synergy between Warren Wilson College and the North Carolina Forest Service, came in 2008 with the Swartz-Ellum Plan. Like Haney's plan, this had four main priorities, of which a forest ecology is first and timber is last. However, there are new elements in there, such as frequent coordination with the Forest Service in terms of burning, such as this. This is a form for prescribed burning on Jones Mountain with the North Carolina Division of Forest Resources, and frequent synergy with the Forest Service in terms of chainsaw training and also service opportunities. Now, and also in 2008, a prescribed burning plan was crafted by the North Carolina Forest Service, or at that time the Division of Forest Resources, for Warren Wilson College. Now, this study comes with a number of stipulations. First of all, there is the information from the North Carolina Forest Service side is a little on the scant side. Most of this comes from correspondences between consulting foresters and officials at Warren Wilson College in one capacity or another. The other thing is that while this is a prime example of how the North Carolina Forest Service has traditionally dealt with private landowners, it does not take into account whether or not other colleges of perhaps similar quality to Warren Wilson in terms of having a college forest undergo the same experiences. There's a quote I would like to read from Alan Haney, which I think most people will probably find amusing, which is to say, there is nothing unusual in a liberal arts college owning a forest. It is less common for a college to use a forest as an educational resource. However, overall, it would seem that the ways in which the North Carolina Forest Service has in fact interacted with Warren Wilson is in fact a prime example of the selecting a forester who can perpetuate the values of the forest and meeting the personal objectives, in turn influencing the Warren Wilson College forest in ways in which the North Carolina Forest Service has approached management in the past. Are there any questions on this? Yes.
So I'm wondering, and this might not have been the kind of sources you were looking at, but I'm wondering if there was any student input at any of these sort of key moments of transition that you were looking at, especially the one in the mid-70s, the timing with the environmental movement.
In fact, student input has changed significantly over the course of the time period I'm talking about. In 1956, you have B.H. Corpening talking about you shouldn't use student labor for this, it's inefficient, you have too many other things to do, if you want to produce timber, contract out to us. However, with the Haney Plan, you have the start of what would later become the forestry crew, the natural resources crew, and starting in 1996 with increased chainsaw training and the student-led CFI, especially under Dr. Bill Davis, you have more student involvement. For instance, Jim Eikenberry, who wrote the 2002 plan, was a student manager of the forestry crew. So in fact, it has kind of been an upward curve of student involvement in these processes.
You mentioned aesthetics being a concern, and I'm wondering if what kind of weight it's given versus other concerns, and if you found that to be consistent throughout a certain time period.
Aesthetics really becomes a primary concern following 1970. For instance, I noted in 1970 that A.G. Oxner claimed that the Ornelson College, in fact, had greater potential for recreation, which in turn goes hand in hand with aesthetic uses of the forest. Again, aesthetics have always been somewhat of a priority, but during the era of timber primacy, that was kind of downplayed in favor of just having solid trees from which you can produce timber. Since the 1970s and since the Ed Cliff memo, aesthetics and in particular good view sheds, for instance, say you're looking at Jones Mountain and you see a continuous unbroken line of trees, aesthetically enticing, has become a larger priority. Yes?
You're saying in the 1970s the Forest Service made sort of a big switch from timber primacy to valuing recreation and other things. Could you go more into, how did that happen in the Forest Service bureaucracy?
It primarily happened through a sense of, at the Forest Service, increasing complaints from private landowners and from the general public that the Forest Service was out of, across the nation in general, in North Carolina also, that the Forest Service was out of touch with the common people, that they were only in it for timber production. You have, at this time, out in Washington, large swaths of forest land being clear-cut, This coincides with the first instance of Earth Day in 1970, the burgeoning environmentalist movement. There was a massive push kind of against the current, going in, collecting timber, leaving, coming back a few years later, collecting the rest of the timber when it had grown up. And as a result, the Forest Service kind of reflected on itself, particularly with the chief. This starts with Ed Cliff, the chief, who kind of sent a memo out to be dispersed to various forest services that basically elucidated that it was time for a change in official policy. If you would like, I can read you an example. Ed Cliff's 1970s memo read, "Our programs are out of balance to meet public needs for the environmental 1970s, and we are receiving criticism from all sides. The forest services are seeking a balanced program with full concern for the quality of the environment." Anything else?
I'd like to follow up on the earlier question about student involvement in the caring for the forest here. Initially, some of the reluctance or resistance to that was coming from the Forest Service itself. How has the Forest Service changed in its attitudes towards student work?
Generally, since we have been framing it less of an operation for, say, financial recoup and more as an educational opportunity, particularly since the Haney Plan, which lists student education as one of the highest priorities, that has generally marked the shift. And that is generally that reframing of it from being like student labor to produce timber to student labor in order to teach students how to do something. While that was always there, since it has become a larger priority, our relationship with the NCFS has kind of shifted accordingly.
And that must be one of the main differences between the way that the Forest Service interacts with a lot of private landowners and the college, right?
That is correct. Anything else? All right.
take just a moment to get computers reset and get started.
Sorry. I was thinking this.
Yes.
Make sure everybody's okay. Well, we're going to have quite a change of pace. We're still in the woods, but in a much different way now. So we're moving back to the 19th century, and one of the things that you'll notice about the presentations is that they all deal with some aspect of local history. So this is one of the requirements that we have in the senior seminar in History and Political Science, because we want our students to be working with archival materials, and often they work in the local archives. Russell has taken a little bit different approach in that most of his materials are not coming straight out of the local archives. Some of them are from private collections of people who live in Hendersonville and other places. He's going to take us a little bit into South Carolina and then eventually move through this region as prisoners of war move into the woods and back out again. And I think we've got a really fascinating presentation today then on Civil War Union prisoners' escapes, and I will let Russell take it from there.
Sure. I'll set up my timer quick. Okay. Like we said, thanks for coming to our Capstone Carnival, and thank you for attending this session in particular. My presentation is entitled Remarkable Kindness and Efficient Help, Prisoner of War Unionist Relationship in Western North Carolina. So, by 1864, both the Union and Confederate States were tired of war. In 1861, politicians had promised that it would last no longer than 90 days, but 3 years later, neither side came close to victory. The Confederacy, especially, was having problems securing enough men and supplies to keep its armies in fighting condition, and the Union was having trouble with politicians who wanted to sue for peace. In March 1864, President Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant commander of all Union forces. The strategy Grant devised was different from the strategies that the Union had tried in earlier years. First, he believed that waging war off of the battlefield was just as important as what happened between the armies. He gave General William Sherman the task of finding his way deep into the heart of the Confederacy, from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to Atlanta, Georgia, and farther if possible. Second, he called a halt to the prisoner exchange program, which had existed since the early days of the war, and allowed both sides to return captured soldiers to the units more quickly, instead of leaving them in prisons behind enemy lines. With this order, Grant created a new difficulty for the Confederacy, that of managing tens of thousands of prisoners of war. Among these prisoners was a group of about 1,500 Union officers who had been captured in the previous few months. When Grant ordered the end of the exchange program, they were housed in an old warehouse building in Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. In March, while Grant planned his spring campaign, 2 Union officers led a raiding party toward Richmond with the intention of freeing both the officers and about 20,000 enlisted men held at Belle Isle nearby. The raid failed, but it still convinced Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet that Richmond was not a good place to keep prisoners. Consequently, on May 2, 1864, the officers at Libby were ordered to pack their belongings and get ready to move south. Their destination was the town of Macon, Georgia. In Macon, they lived on the former fairgrounds with a single building, a small group of pine trees, and their tents for shelter. Many tried digging tunnels under the stockade, but guards discovered all of them before they could be finished. By July, Sherman had reached the outskirts of Atlanta, only 80 miles north of Macon. The prisoners would have to be moved again, this time to Savannah. Conditions were somewhat better at Savannah, where the prisoners lived on the shady grounds of the Marine Hospital. Once again, they had no luck digging their way out, although not for lack of trying. In September, Sherman's army captured Atlanta, and since it seemed like Savannah would most likely be his next target, the prisoners were moved to Charleston, South Carolina. Their stay in Charleston was very brief because there was an epidemic of yellow fever in the city a few weeks after they arrived. While only a handful of prisoners died, their guards fared much worse, and in October the group was transferred to Columbia because of its healthier climate. While the climate may have been better in Columbia, the city was entirely unprepared for the prisoners' arrival. While a couple hundred Union enlisted men had been held in the county jail since 1862, there were no facilities that could accommodate the 1,500 officers from Charleston. They spent their first night in the rail yard, and the next day were marched across the Congaree River to an open field about 3 miles west of downtown. There was no stockade. The boundaries of the camp were only defined by a line of stakes driven into the ground called the deadline. Anyone who crossed the deadline would be shot without warning by the guards who were posted every 100 feet. As you might imagine, a few hundred officers attempted to escape. The vast majority of these were tracked down with bloodhounds and recaptured, but several dozen, at least, successfully made it back to Union lines. The most common destination was Knoxville, Tennessee, which the Union Army had captured in late 1863. Of the possible destinations, Knoxville was the easiest to get to, if you can call a few hundred-mile walk through the mountains in late fall easy. What made the journey substantially easier than other routes to the coast or into Georgia was the assistance of the local people. I would like to use the experience of one small group of prisoners to illustrate both the types of assistance that escaped prisoners received and to briefly discuss the political climate of Western North Carolina as a whole during late 1864. 2 of these men kept diaries on their journey, and a third wrote his reminiscences after the war, making this group one of the best documented examples of the many who made the same journey. I've attempted to create a map of their route when the sources are detailed enough to allow it. The group itself included Captains Chauncey Aldrich, Daniel Langworthy, and George Starr, and Lieutenants Josiah Terwilliger and George Hastings. Aldrich, Langworthy, and Terwilliger had served in the same regiment, the 85th New York Infantry. Hastings came from the 24th New York Battery, and Starr from the 104th New York Infantry. All except Starr had been captured at the same time at Plymouth, North Carolina in April 1864. Starr had been a prisoner since the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 and had attempted to escape twice before, first from Libby and then from Macon. Hastings, who had also attempted to escape from Macon, owned a Confederate uniform. While this was Langworthy's first attempt, he had a compass and a bottle of turpentine purchased from a sympathetic Confederate guard. The 5 men had not initially planned to travel together. On the night of October 10th, Aldrich, Langworthy, and Terwilliger were watching the guards and waiting for the perfect opportunity when Starr and Hastings approached and asked whether or not they were planning to escape. The trio answered yes, but Starr and Hastings made no commitment to follow. When the moon finally went down, about 3 o'clock in the morning of October 11th, Aldrich, Langworthy, and Terwilliger got their chance. Langworthy described it in his reminiscences. As the moon was nearing the horizon, one of the comrades said, "If you start when that man is near the end of the beat as you are crossing the guard line, he will be at the other end of his beat. He will have turned around and will see you, for there is a fire on both sides." We said yes, but we think we will try it. We will go abreast, so if he shoots, he must fire through one before he hits the next. When the moon was well down and the guard neared our end of his beat, we started, going carefully. We were crossing his beat when he arrived at the other end, and he did what he had not done before. He stopped with his back towards us, took his gun from his shoulder, and stooped over the fire. We thought then, as we did several other times, that we were favored by our Heavenly Father. The 3 men made their way to a hollow not far from the camp. They panicked for a moment when they saw 2 silhouettes at the top of the hill behind them, but it turned out that Starr and Hastings had decided to try their luck as well. The next day, the 5 men set out towards the northwest and covered a few miles before hearing the baying of bloodhounds behind them. Langworthy smeared turpentine on the soles of their shoes because it would irritate the dogs' noses and lungs, causing them to lose the trail. Langworthy's strategy worked and they continued their journey. On October 13th, they encountered their first Southern civilian, a Mrs. Cook. She and her daughters discovered the men as they were cooking their rations and threatened to turn them in. Hastings spoke with them and found out that one of Mrs. Cook's sons was a Confederate soldier who had been captured and treated well in a Union prison. He made what Langworthy called an appeal to motherly instincts and convinced her to keep their secret. A few days later, near the town of 96, South Carolina, they encountered a slave, Charles Thompson, the first admittee who would help them. He brought the group 6 loaves of cornbread, 2 quarts of molasses, and 6 pounds of bacon, and told them how to find the Greenville and Columbia Railroad, which they could follow northwest toward the mountains. At Greenville, the group struck the Greenville and North Carolina Turnpike, there's Greenville, and followed it toward the town of Marietta, South Carolina. Near Marietta, they met a freed woman named Betsy Turner, who fed them breakfast and told them that her husband John could help them. John, when he arrived, gave them directions from his house to the house of the first Unionist they would encounter in North Carolina, including how to avoid a Confederate post on the way. Betsy sent them away with fresh baked bread, and the next day they crossed the state line at Jones Gap and found the house of Billy Case near Cedar Mountain. Case told the officers that they would never reach Union lines without a guide, but that a group of Unionist refugees and Confederate deserters would be setting out for Knoxville in the next 2 weeks. He sent them to the home of Ed Merrill. Merrill's situation is probably the most unusual that the group encountered. Although he was a slave, his master was away serving in the Confederate Army, leaving Merrill in complete control over his business, including the role of providing for the master's family. Merrill guided the men to a Baptist preacher, who in turn delivered them to the house of Sheriff Robert Hamilton, where they would spend the next 9 days. Hamilton, because of his position as sheriff, was exempt from Confederate service and largely above the suspicion of his neighbors. During the day, he made a show of tracking down Confederate deserters, but at home he provided for 2 separate groups of escaped officers from Columbia. When Langworthy asked, Hamilton described the situation in the mountains. Quote, "There's a terrible state of affairs here so near the border, so much worse than it is in the north. My neighbors, some of them are Confederates, and others good Union men who do not wish to abandon everything and go north, but who will not enter the Southern Army. They're in the woods and the mountains. Some of them have been there for 2 years." End quote. Other Unionists who were prepared to leave the mountains went to Knoxville and enlisted in the Union Army. While the men stayed with Sheriff Hamilton, 2 recruiters were gathering a group to do just that, and when they were ready, all of the men would cross the mountains together. On November 5th, Hamilton gave the officers 6 days' rations, including cornbread, rye bread, beef, and bacon, and led them to the rendezvous point where they met a group of Union recruits and 5 of their fellow escaped officers. These 5, 2 captains and 3 lieutenants, had jumped off of the train cars between Charleston and Columbia and made their way into the mountains as well. All told, the party consisted of 10 officers and 19 deserters and refugees, including 1 freedman. Although there was some safety in numbers and their guides undoubtedly knew what they were doing, they were far from safe. While waiting near the Mills River for more Union recruits, Confederate soldiers attacked. Only a few of the Unionists were armed, but they formed a firing line and allowed the rest to escape. Hamilton decided that it would be too dangerous to wait any longer and led them over Mount Pisgah to Spring Creek Gap near Hot Springs. On the 10th, they crossed the border into Tennessee. Tennessee was no safer than North Carolina. At one of the first houses they encountered, several men were digging a grave for a Unionist who had been shot by a Confederate sympathizer the day before. On the 11th, they were stopped by a Unionist named Milt Spurgeon, who had gathered a group of his neighbors and fortified a bluff as a defense against Confederate attack. He was suspicious of the group's identity and claimed to have enough men to, quote, "blow them to hell in a minute," 2 of the officers recalled. Once the group had convinced him that they were all on the same side, Spurgeon led them to the house of a man named Long, who slaughtered his only hog to feed them. The next day, the 12th, they passed through Sevierville, where Starr noted that every house was occupied by Union men. After crossing the French Broad River, the group split up. Aldrich and 3 others continued the last 8 miles to the Union line at Strawberry Plains, while Hastings, Starr, and the rest stopped with a widow who provided not only dinner, but also a feather bed on the floor, the first that any of the men had slept on for well over 6 months. On the morning of the 13th, they too covered the last few miles to Strawberry Plains. At Strawberry Plains, they borrowed horses from the 10th Michigan Cavalry and rode to Union headquarters in Knoxville. One of the first things they did after getting paid was to have their picture taken.
That's awesome.
The officers would have had no chance at all of getting to Knoxville without the help of the mountain people. Why were these people so willing to help? The demographics of western North Carolina were very different from those of central and upstate South Carolina. Only a few mountain families owned slaves, and one historian estimates that only 10% of the population was black, whether free or enslaved. While many white mountain families were suspicious of the eastern North Carolina slave-owning class, Unionists were far from being a majority. All of the representatives from the western counties who went to the secession convention in May 1861 voted to leave the Union. While attitudes may have shifted somewhat between 1861 and late 1864, and some families who had been on the fence became Unionists, other Unionists had left the state for safer territory in East Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Individuals who supported the Union did so for many different reasons, depending on their identities and situations. Some historians have cited the importance of local traditions to the mountain people, which fueled their regional identity and separated them from the larger state political body and economy. Others have emphasized the importance of class, claiming that elites and poor farmers were most likely to support secession, and that there were fewer people from these groups in the mountains. While these historians have explained mountain unionism on a large scale, they do not answer the question of why people like Sheriff Hamilton were willing to risk their lives, their families' lives, and their homes to help complete strangers leave the Confederacy. None of the officers wrote down what Hamilton might have said about it, if anything. It is possible that Hamilton's reasons for staying with the Union were similar to those of his fellow guide, Daniel Ellis, a veteran of the Mexican War who called secession a crime which can but freeze the blood of humanity with the most profound indignation and horror. While Ellis considered enlisting in the Union Army in 1861, he realized that he would be more useful to the cause as a guide than a soldier. By the end of the war, he claimed to have led thousands of volunteers, refugees, and escaped prisoners to Union lines. No matter what Hamilton's motivations may have been, the officers were extremely thankful for what Langworthy called his remarkable kindness and efficient help. They sent him a care package from New York after the war and praised him generously in their speeches and reminiscences. The five men also kept in touch with each other into the early 20th century, and Langworthy noted at the end of his memoir that as of April 3, 1915, he and Starr were the only members still living. Starr died in 1916, leaving Langworthy the last surviving member until his own death in 1919 at age 87. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes for questions by my clock. Yeah.
I'm really interested in this moving prisoners thing, because it seems a little different than moving like couches or something. So, can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, almost always it was by railroad. It was the most secure and the fastest way to transport them. The trip from Libby Prison in Richmond to Macon, Georgia was definitely the longest. And it was done over several days and in several different groups. But by rail, there were good rail connections in at least this part of the Confederacy. That was not true everywhere. And so they would load them up in cattle cars and close the doors, put guards on the doors, and ship them away. There were a lot of people, as I mentioned, the second group of officers that they met in the mountains, who they ended up crossing the border with, escaped from the train between Charleston and Columbia, which there were a couple dozen who did the same thing, and most of them were recaptured, but a few were successful.
Just to sort of follow up on that, how common was it for, like, was it just because these guys were in Libya and they needed to get them out of Richmond, or were other, like, say, if you were held at, in Missouri or somewhere farther west, would you have been moved around this much?
Well, these were the only prisons for officers.
Oh,
so
okay.
any officer who was captured would have ended up here. Yeah, and then there was movement around in the Western Theater with enlisted, but they really don't know as much about that. Sure.
Can you talk some more about the sources that you used? You mentioned that they wrote memoirs. Were there other sources other than their personal writings that you were able to use to track their progress?
Well, like I mentioned, George Starr and Chauncey Aldrich kept diaries during their journey. Starr wrote a paper after the war that I used pretty extensively. And I mean, it's based on his diary, but there's more analysis, less sort of day-by-day stuff. Langworthy wrote a book in 1915. It's fascinating. It's a great story. It's not as specific on dates because it was written so much later. And then Isaiah Conley, who was one of the officers that they met in the second group in the mountains, also kept a diary that was later published as part of a book. It's an absolutely wonderful source. It has the dates, the mileage, and everything like that, although I could only use it really for the last few sections of it. Other than that, because all of these men were officers in Libby, Macon, all of these other prisons, there are hundreds of books and letters and speeches that were written dealing with their experience because they were educated and they were leaving a record, essentially. There's a whole genre of prisoner of war accounts from after the war, from about 1870 into the early 20th century. That answers your question. There's a lot less on the side of the Unionists. Like Robert Hamilton, I couldn't find a date even when he was elected sheriff. He was in Transylvania County. And I need to go back and look up like William Case, but at first glance, there's really not much, which is a shame. That would be fascinating, and I'd like to do more work on it in the future.
Well, thank you. My name is Aldrich, and that's my great grandfather.
Yeah, I was going to thank you for attending, and thank you for coming. Well, I hope you enjoyed it.
Very much.
Okay. Actually, I've got a couple of questions. Maybe you could comment a little bit more on just the society in the mountains and in this area between the two armies. The story that you tell of the black man whose master has left to fight for the Confederacy and left him in charge of the household. And what does he do? He starts putting up northern escaped prisoners of war. I mean, in your reading of this, do you think that was an anomaly, that was something strange, or are these the kinds of stories that we might discover if we looked a little bit more in this region?
I think I know what you're asking. As far as there's sort of two different things. It was not at all uncommon for them to get help from African Americans, but they were ostensibly freed under the Emancipation Proclamation, but on the ground still enslaved. And so that wasn't uncommon at all for someone who was enslaved to have complete control over a household, because I've never encountered anything like it, even in the mountains. But I think it was Stephanie Camp who estimated that only 10% of the population up here wasn't black at all. So I think given that low percentage, the chance of it happening wouldn't be common at all.
And then the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is because usually when we hear about prisoners of war in the Civil War, we think of Andersonville. And so you're talking about different prisons for enlisted men and for officers.
Right.
Do the officers ever comment on this and say, wow, we're lucky, or this doesn't seem fair, or anything like that?
Occasionally, they would run into the enlisted prisoners. Aldrich, the four who were taken captive at Plymouth, Aldrich, Langworthy, Terwilliger, and Hastings, were actually taken to Andersonville first and sat outside the prison. Actually, yeah, Langworthy remembered talking to Captain Hortz, who was the infamous commandant of that prison. And so they knew what was going on. Later on, the prisoners who didn't escape were taken to Charlotte and exchanged almost at the end of the war. And they also encountered prisoners who had been at Salisbury, which was another enlisted man's prison after Andersonville. So I don't think they necessarily knew the whole story while they were in prison, but they definitely found out later on.
Were they segregated because of their education and class level, or because they didn't want officers with enlisted folks and perhaps try to foment more problems?
You pretty much hit the nail on the head. It was a combination of, I mean, there's still a fairly strong idea if there's a difference between an enlisted man and an officer in terms of just like caliber of soldier. So there's a little bit of that going on, but I think more importantly, it was to keep the officers from starting a rebellion in prison, all of that. So.
Thank you very much. Oh, you can do it. I'm going to put the spotlight up. You all like that? That sounds great. Well, we've got the bright lights back on here, so our final star can shine. And here we're moving back into the 20th century, and we're going to focus on Warren Wilson College itself. And over the last year, we've had a lot of talk on this campus about issues of diversity and of the college's approach to the issue of diversity. And one of the things that I think you'll find fascinating about this paper is that Garrett is looking back at this story and how the college and before the college, even the actual farm school, considered issues of diversity here on campus. And I think that you'll be interested to find out that this story actually goes back a bit further than what is commonly talked about here. So our final presentation is by Garrett Shaffey, and the title of his presentation is Racial Integration at Warren Wilson College, Christian Duty, and Arthur Bannerman.
Thank you guys for being here, sitting so patiently. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Diana in the archives. She was the inspiration for this paper. It's kind of a Presbyterian aficionado and has read through a lot of information in her time at the archives here. And I went down and asked her, I said, what do you think really needs to be researched? And kind of made it easy on myself there, but she gave me a little bit of this. So I'd also like to thank Rodney Lytle, who has been here 45 years and has a great insight into some of the old history of race relations. He's met Arthur Bannerman himself, so I thank those two. So when you think about what Phil was describing earlier as the early time period at Warren Wilson College, there's kind of this parallel that's relevant to some things that have been happening on campus lately. You know, some of the things that we could say around race and the issues that we have with that, and trying to efforts of inclusion and making people feel like they're welcome here on campus. And I'm here to tell you guys today that that history of Warren Wilson College has been here since our founding, is extremely deep. Let's see. The 1952 acceptance of Alma Shippey was the earliest example that most people know of our efforts here at Warren Wilson to integrate. Alma Shippey was accepted that year in 1952 as the first black student to attend college in the state of North Carolina. And one of the first to attend college in the United States. What people don't know as well as this particular event, which is historic, being 2 years before the Brown versus Board of Ed decision, was that we had nearly 20 years of history of having black and African American students and all kinds of cultures and races on campus here, going all the way to the early 1930s. And what caused this to happen specifically at Warren Wilson College, and not at other places like Montreat or other colleges, was that we had great leaders like Arthur Bannerman, president who was here for 35 years, who watched this school go from a farm school to a junior college and eventually saw it become a four-year college. And it was people like him and the Jensens, the DeVries, and their convictions with the Presbyterian Church, a specific type of conviction that was unique to a Northern Presbyterian church. And Bannerman's convictions about race and having these people on campus in the early 30s stemmed from his moral convictions towards Christian duty and Christian brotherhood, towards accepting race. And that stems throughout his explanations for why that happened. But for those of you who don't know Arthur Bannerman, or know Bannerman only as a place that BK tells you to print when the printer's broken, that this gentleman was truly an astounding person. From people like Rodney Lytle, who knew him, who's personally met him and interviewed his goddaughter Lucille. He was a kind-hearted man, no hate in his heart, very gentle, kind-natured, noted for his patience and clear spirit. And in speaking just towards, Warren Wilson being a college that was founded by Northern Presbyterians, Arthur Bannerman himself came from an old background with Presbyterians. Both his parents were Presbyterian missionaries who had served in missionary work in Africa and assumedly deeply faithful people. So these principles were instilled with Arthur Bannerman at a young age, and he brought a lot of that energy down here. So Arthur Bannerman spent time eventually ending up in New Jersey, and he came down to Warren Wilson College in 1928 under the recommendation of a Presbyterian friend of his, with only the intention of staying just for a little while to teach. Now, Arthur Bannerman's connection with the Northern Presbyterian Church is unique. When we look at Warren Wilson College, we look around ourselves, and we are one of few colleges in this area that were founded by Northern Presbyterians, and it's very distinct. We need to highlight the difference between what makes a Northern and Southern Presbyterian church and what their different beliefs are, and why Warren Wilson would be interested in integrating, and why Montreat College 10 miles down the road didn't even house black churchmen on campus when Warren Wilson did. And the answer to that stems back to war periods like the Civil War, World War I, where there was this humanistic growth in the church, in progressive thinkers that were based predominantly where Bannerman grew up, in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. These Northern Presbyterians were strongly in belief that social justice was meant to be within the church. Now, this goes contrary to what many Southern Presbyterians believed in a process known as jure divino, or divine law, which was talking about that the church was sacred and that it didn't really, issues like slavery and issues that had to do with society almost didn't have a place in the church. So Warren Wilson brought in many thinkers early on that were geared up very much towards what would become foreign mission work and home mission work in places like Appalachia, and some of the reasons why the farm school boys would even have this college. So an early example that we have of that most people are unaware of is that we had black students come to campus and black groups from the local community come in the 30s. And there's a quote I'm going to read from Arthur Bannerman from January 1941 Asheville Farm School report describing kind of what I was relating, attempting to make the connection between the fact that his Northern Presbyterian Christian convictions of brotherhood and inclusion, along with those, facilitated this process on having blacks on campus. So I quote Bannerman saying, when he refers to interracial goodwill and integration, a practical demonstration of this kind is achieved by having on campus from time to time members of the African American race in order that Christian attitudes may be actually practiced in this field of social relationship. So that's just a good example of how, you have to consider the fact that this is the 1930s, this is the Jim Crow South, and that it was dangerous having, for people who are unaware of Jim Crow laws, blacks would not be allowed to be dancing together, eating together, anything, same bathroom. So the early examples that we have where black community members would come on campus, we'd be in church with them, and we'd be either praying or having a social hour, and Bannerman describes some of those early 1930 visits from the black community as being some of the first times any Warren Wilson boys had come into contact with African Americans. So this was an experiment, and the church knew that, and the Home Missions Board that Bannerman was representing also was aware of that too. This was the progressive edge of it. And he notes that the Warren Wilson Farm boys in that early time period were astounded at how cultured the African Americans were. They literally just didn't understand. They had not been exposed to it. So that's kind of an aspect of Bannerman too, is that he really believed in this experiential education. It really didn't matter to him. He criticized heavily people who would give lip service, as he said, to, oh, racism is bad and we should have more African Americans integrate on campus. But we have African Americans come on campus. They didn't have the conferences and host people like we did. And Bannerman says that just having that group on campus for whatever amount of time is more valuable than 1,000 sermons on brotherhood. So he was a man of action, and that showed for sure in that process. So another early example that we have is there was the 1943 Hazing Conference. And just to give you some background, the Hazing Conference was started by a group of Northern philanthropists that were church-guided, Northern Presbyterians. This conference was started at first for school tutoring and then moved towards a forum as it became integrated for blacks and whites to get together and discuss some of the social issues around that. Now this conference that they were putting on, called the Hazing Conference, had never been held in the South. It was up in the North in New York State, Connecticut. A friend of Arthur Bannerman's, and truly a testament to one of the values that he brought to this college, was his ability to bring people onto campus, these Northern thinkers, who in a funny way are remembered as giving the Southern hospitality with Yankee efficiency. So that's something that he was good for. And he brought this one man on campus named Jim Goddard, and this just goes to show how Warren Wilson's reputation had grown since those early examples that I just gave you, is that he was part of a accrediting college agency, and that's how he met Arthur Bannerman. And he had been to literally hundreds of colleges and described that none of them were as fit for housing African Americans on campus for this conference than Warren Wilson. So in 1943, when they approached him, this historic event, the conference was finally held in the South at Warren Wilson. And there's a great account from Jim, Arthur Bannerman's friend, where he says this woman was checking in at the counter, and she looks over at Jim and says, am I in a room with African Americans? And Jim replies, well, this is Warren Wilson, that might be the case. And she replied by saying, I guess that'd be fine, you know. And this was kind of the early period that we can see people just getting on with the image that the school was trying to take on. That woman and the African American woman did end up rooming together and became friends. And part of the reason why those conferences were successful, and part of the reasons why integration at Warren Wilson was successful, was because we were bold enough to have African Americans on campus to pray in church with us, to share the same space, to eat the same food. There's early examples from Miss Larson, who's also a pivotal person with some of the girls here at Warren Wilson, describing that some of the girls were afraid to serve African Americans because their dad had either physically taken violence against them for doing so, or there was a whole lot there. And Miss Larson said, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. You can go back to the dorm. And the ladies stayed, and in years to come, that same process would happen. Warren Wilson teachers would never, and Bannerman would never force the students to integrate. On their own accord, they had people like Almost Should Be come here, and they came to Arthur Bannerman, and they asked him personally. They were never forced to do anything. So I'm going to read a good quote from Arthur Bannerman describing the early functions of our college as they relate to the mission work and the influence of Northern Presbyterian theology and integration. So he's discussing that and saying, implied with all these principles pointed towards the future is the pioneering nature of the work of the college. Now, pioneering may be done with a pack horse, or it may be done with ideas. Most of the world's pack horse pioneering has been complete, but spiritual pioneering is still in its infancy. That is the missionary task of the church today, and that is the mission of Warren Wilson College. It is not a liberal arts college committed to the task of keeping alive the cultural heritage of the past, nor is it a professional school engaged in turning out successive classes of doctors and engineers. In fact, the name college may be misleading, only in limited sense of the term. But regardless of terminology, Warren Wilson College is a community of people whose objectives will ever lie beyond the next hill. Thank you. Wow. Any questions? Yes.
You sort of answered this, I think, but I just want to hit on it again. So did Bannerman talk about having these conferences and having groups of African Americans visit campus, did he talk about it explicitly as education? Like, was it part of what the students were learning? Is that how he would cast it sort of to the outside world? Is that kind of how he sold it, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, at least within the faculty memos that I've read, there's stemming all the way from Dr. Randolph with his input in what was known as progressive education. What later came was social education. They really wanted these farm boys to interact on live situations with the community. So within the faculty, they would call it more social education, but within the outside community, like letters that Bannerman corresponded with people being like, well, what's going on campus at Warren Wilson? He'd be like, why should we have a problem at a Christian college having blacks on campus? He put the umbrella of the church over it, and I think that's kind of how
You mentioned at one point that the serving girls would, were afraid that their fathers would beat them for serving African American sort of things. Was there a lot of pushback from the broader campus community on, the college kind of hedging towards integration? Or?
Some of the later, at least by the time Alma Shippey came in, there was correspondence between Jensen and several people wondering whether enrollment would go down because of having African Americans on campus. But I think because of the Christian influence and the fact that, at least when Randolph was here, he was a minister and Bannerman of deep faith, like I was saying. So just having them in that church presence kind of took away this stigma of being against Banner. The one instance where there was pushback was the basketball games with blacks and whites. That for some reason that was the one event. But everything else seemed to go pretty well. No one left school explicitly, and obviously by the time Alma Shippey came, there was only one vote against him. 50. One vote. Not too much.
I'm wondering if you've looked at other farm schools in the time and whether they have the same humanistic viewpoint that we found in school almost.
It's interesting that you mentioned the farm school aspect of it, because right around the time that this was happening in the 1940s was right when we were moving away from that and moving more into becoming a traditional college and not as much based towards, we still had vocational programs for the farm boys and doing the farm work, but it was becoming more, less of farm school. I mean, there are instances where most of the schools that we related to on a church level were from the north and not specifically farm schools. If that can answer your question.
Do you have an idea of who Bannerman was reaching out to in the African American communities to have that, to be inviting them to campus or having them come to campus? And then I want to know what the topic of the hazing conference was. Sounds very strange. What was that?
Yeah, I should be more clear. The hazing conference, not the hazing. Arthur Bannerman, who worked for the Home Missions Board of the Presbyterian Church, reached out through the church to other church-related schools. That's kind of how he did it. It would be like, I'm the Home Missions Board, I'm trying, this is a Christian college, please come to our school and we'll accept you. It wasn't so much him on a personal note under him as a representative of the Home of Mission Boards. So at least, for instance, when the Cuban students came here, we were affiliated with a school in Cuba called La Progresiva. So because they were Presbyterians, we traded students, and a lot of that happened with African Americans as well. Does that answer you?
Yeah.
Yes.
You're saying before the differentiation between North and South Presbyterian
Right.
was, and I'm wondering, being in the South, if there was kind of pushback from the religious community, some of the transpirers.
There's note by Bannerman saying specifically and others that Asheville seemed to be more progressive in the sense. There's an Asheville Times article from the 1940s that talks about different Southern Presbyterian churches' opinions, church members' opinions. They were saying that, why are we being forced to pray with African Americans? The church has never forced us to associate. This is natural. So there was this pushback. But I mean, keeping in mind, the KKK was parading in Asheville in the 30s. So this is right around the time that we're having black girls come on the campus and sing to us. The KKK are going to go down there and parade, stuff. It's just, and that's the thing about the racism aspect of it, is because all the way into when Rodney Lytle was visiting campus in the 60s, he had to duck as he was driving in his car through Tennessee to come. I mean, we're talking, so racism kind of happened in waves and hung around in pockets, but in Asheville it was noted as being more progressive in general. I didn't answer your question about the Hazen Conference. It was started as a way to help students get tutored for tutoring, but the Hazen Foundation was like more interested in African American communities. It became a figurehead for integration through education, if that makes sense. So they're trying to educate young Black people. That's a lot to cover, I'm sorry. Thanks.
Thank you.